Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Byron and I'm a traffic engineer based in the US, and this is your source for getting a unique view of traffic and transportation from a traffic engineer. As always, if you like learning about traffic and transportation, consider subscribing to my channel or following me on Twitter. In this video, I'm going to talk about how massive the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is. You may have heard this bill called by another name, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan. So what is this bill? Transportation infrastructure bills come in all shapes and sizes. Because of that, it can be a little confusing. One of the first things you should know is these bills have an expiry date. The US government goes, here, we're going to authorize these amounts of funding and spending for these amount of years. Once the years pass by, the funding is no longer there. For example, the last bill that was signed was the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST Act. That bill was signed by Obama in 2015 and was to last 5 years. So what happens when a signed bill is approaching its expiry date? One of three options will play out. The first option is to let it expire and replace it with nothing. This would cut off all the funding that it was providing. This typically doesn't happen. The second option is to pass an extension of the bill. This would extend the bill and not change it by much. This is usually used as a stopgap measure until the third option is figured out. And the third option is the US government can move to sign an entirely new bill. At the time the FAST Act was going to expire, it was actually extended for one more year. So we are actually in its 6th year, which begs the question, what will happen now? At this moment, it looks like an entirely new bill will be signed into law. This new bill is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan, and it's looking entirely different than previous bills. Well, just how different? The obvious thing to point out is just the sheer size of spending that is in this new Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan. For reference, the FAST Act, which was the previous transportation bill, provided approximately $305 billion US over 5 years when it was signed. For comparison, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill will provide $1 trillion US over 5 years. That's a huge difference. To really understand why and how it is this large, we have to break it down a little further. What makes comparing transportation infrastructure bills confusing is sometimes a bill will reauthorize existing funding programs, and sometimes a bill will only add new spending. In some cases, a bill will do both. When a bill reauthorizes existing funding, it usually continues grant programs that cycles every year or two. And then it also includes funding of the various departments. When a bill authorizes new spending, this can mean many things, including shovel-ready or not shovel-ready projects. This bipartisan infrastructure plan will do both. On the other hand, the FAST Act was mainly for renewing existing funding. We have to actually go back to 2009 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or aka the stimulus bill, for an example of significant spending in new infrastructure. This stimulus bill in 2009 contained new transportation infrastructure spending of about $48 billion US. For comparison, the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure plan will have at least $500 billion in new infrastructure spending. That's a massive difference. As a matter of fact, if you were to add up the last two transportation bills and the infrastructure spending from the 2009 stimulus bill, they would still total to be less than the proposed bipartisan infrastructure plan. Another thing to note is that this new infrastructure bill isn't a pure transportation bill. It contains new spending for water infrastructure, broadband, and other non-transportation related items. In other words, we're not exactly comparing apples to apples. So in summary, this new bipartisan infrastructure plan is so large because not only does it renew and reauthorizes existing programs and funding, but it's also the largest new infrastructure spending that we have seen in recent times. And this got me thinking, how does it compare to infrastructure spending in US history? Although there are some claims that this would be the largest infrastructure spending in US history, it doesn't quite pass that yet. If you consider spending compared to the gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the total value of goods produced or services provided in a year in a country, the New Deal had around a slightly higher level of spending in the 1930s at 1.3% of GDP. For reference, some estimates have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan at 1.25% of GDP. And this 1.25% of GDP doesn't reach the all-time levels that we've seen in the 1970s, which averaged around 2% of GDP. To conclude, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan will be the largest amount of infrastructure spending that this country has seen for quite some time. It is not, though, record-breaking or the largest in US history. But the story is still being written, and we could experience passage of another $3.5 trillion spending bill that's being talked about right now. Although the $3.5 trillion spending bill is not hard infrastructure, it would push spending to levels not seen in US history. I'd like to note that at the time of making this video, the $1 trillion Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan and the $3.5 trillion spending bill has not been signed into law, so things could still change. For all the working and aspiring engineers out there, the signing of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan will lead to a demand of engineering and construction jobs for years to come. I hope you're able to learn something from this video. As always, let me know if you have any questions or comments down below. Until next time, I'll see you later. Bye bye.